Good evening, everyone. This is really amazing. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here. Let me just correct a couple of things in the introduction, very kind introduction. One is that I'm actually from Arizona State University. As you know, Arizona is the only state that has two state universities. They couldn't get along with one another, so they have two state universities. And I'm from Arizona State University, which is in Phoenix, not the one in Tucson. And the title of the language was What is in the Language? And what I was trying to think about was actually how to think about different ways in which equity and equality may be understood and have been understood, and what is in those different understanding, and what we say in those different words that we are actually talking about. But I want to actually start today first by remembering women in Syria. And I want to remember the woman, the doctor in the hospital who was helping women who were giving birth to premature children because of the war. And the way she said, she didn't understand how the world could sleep, knowing what's happening in Syria. And I'm thinking about those women who are giving birth under those conditions and raising their children under those conditions. And I know this is not a very good celebratory way to start a talk, but I think part of being who we are in this world as women, as human beings, is exactly to remember that one cannot actually think about equality and think about equity without thinking about all those who are living under the condition of precarity, under the condition where even existence, even basic existence are issues. And so for that reason, I really wanted to start with this. But going from there, I want to bring two different ways in which it often has been kind of a debate that goes on the one hand, between kind of what people would consider more kind of conservative ways of thinking about difference. And this gender difference being emphasized often either as biological difference, that gets naturalized, essentialized, that there are just unique biological differences between men and women, and for that reason, we cannot really talk about equality. It has to be, so in that sense, in this context, equality means something different, means that we have to really see the difference and then deal with it based on that. So it's not a way of thinking equality that kind of leads to and is the condition of equality and has to see equality as the end goal in that sense. So in that way, there is also the other dimension of it, which is equality that, for instance, someone, Bonilla Silva, discusses in relation to race when he talks about abstract liberalism. And abstract liberalism means when we claim that we all have equal choices, we all have equal votes, we all are individuals with free choices the same way, so we are equal, so what is the point? What we are talking about? By saying that the condition, the different historical, social, political, economic conditions that are actually the way in which equality becomes impossible, that the condition of voting, the condition of education, everything becomes impossible, are actually not really seen. So for that reason, I want to actually read a couple of things just to give us a sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about these differences in language. And I want to start, first of all, by anthropologists. As you know, being from anthropology major, I'm going to kind of talk about anthropologists a little bit more. Veena Das, an Indian anthropologist, actually asks first the following questions in relation to gender, sexuality, and what she sees kind of in its relation to polity and politics in general. And what she asked is, what happens when the social contract is sexualized, where women's reproduction is seen to rightly belong to the state, so that as citizens, they're obliged to bear legitimate children who will be in turn ready to die for the nation, where sex and death, reproduction and war become part of the same configuration of ideas and institutions through which the nation state sets up defenses to stop off of this uncertainty emanating from dangerous aliens and so on and so forth. This, for many of us, is significant. And why this is significant to equality? It seems that equality, we're talking about legal issues, we're talking about rights, and so what is war doing with this? Think about the way in which often laws and conditions of family relations and so on and so forth gets broken usually under those situations. Think about colonial legacies, for instance. So how under those conditions we all of a sudden realize that there are familial, much more rigid relationship within the family for men, for instance, claim a different kind of power, a different kind of train. How what in the case of Islam, for instance, Sharia law all of a sudden, or Islamic law all of a sudden becomes very predominant, and so on and so forth. But to go in that, again, to go to the theme of the conference, I want to bring this two different notions that I said. So, for instance, in the sense of the notion of equality, in the context of education, for instance, Emmy's son discusses, this is in the context of education and the classroom, treating everyone exactly the same is actually not fair. What equal treatment does do is erase our differences and promote privilege. So in this particular case, if you're actually talking about treating everyone equally, you're actually erasing the fact that there are privileges for some people. So in this sense, equality is giving everyone what they need to be successful. Equality is treating everyone the same way. So equality aims to promote fairness, but it can only work if everyone starts from the same place and needs the same help. So basically, the idea of fairness, even though is the idea that is very difficult to measure, is the idea that is much more fluid, but without considering the conditions under which people are treated equally, it actually really does not reach the equality that we are talking about. So in that sense, it's very important. So again, she argues equity sets the stage for equality as it refers to the fairness of treatment for both women and men, and in that sense to their respective needs. But it's also not just for women, it's something that basically is much more, as the theme of the conference, this event is actually discussing it, is actually for everyone. So equity considers the condition of everyone having fair share of access to resources and so on and so forth. So in tackling these issues, again, between these arguments and all, another anthropologist, along with others, they have done some collective work that is very interesting. They argue that gender roles and male dominance were often dealt with, and this is interesting, we usually consider this as a religious, political, legal discourse, but actually many scholars have contributed to this notion of difference. Even as they have, for instance, tried to denaturalize this idea of biological difference, for instance, some anthropologists, according to this particular research, have started with these stories that they call them hunter stories. They say, in these stories, males evolved to be food providers, stronger, more aggressive, more effective leaders with cooperative and bonding capacities, planning skills and technological inventiveness, tool making, and so on and so forth. In this story, females, on the other hand, never acquired those capacities because they're using historical causalities, because they were burdened by their reproductive roles, by pregnancy, giving birth, location, childcare, and thus become dependent in this story on males for food and protection. So this, according to them, is the cause of the gap that basically has been widened. The problem is that in this story, even though they are thinking about historical differences, but the problem is that it has gone to the point, has been so perpetuated and so constantly internalized that they actually argue that in 1970s, when they were working with men in Los Angeles, this is actually a research done in Los Angeles, okay? What they found really striking is that many men actually use these hunter stories. They suggest that for instance, yes, I mean, we understand that there is a way that we have to think about men as the head of the family, and that they have the authority. And they actually talked about, even when they were trying to empower women, they were talking about, of women as chief mom. And in that sense, there was this idea that even as they were talking about, they said, you know, our hunting past, these are men saying, our hunting past has made us become more tougher and become more risk takers. So these traits have become part of the story that have become actually internalized and highlighting the difference in that sense. So interestingly, they actually argue that, first of all, this story itself is a myth. Why? Because, in fact, according to the story, more than 90% of the people, the early stage when people were actually hunter-gatherers, more than 90% of food was actually provided by gathering, not by hunting. So that itself is very interesting. The other story is how, in the language, the idea that men are the giver of the seeds, so they plant their seeds, and the woman becomes the carrier. So again, this is the idea and the way this story gets told. Is that right? That they have the seeds, and this in and of itself, again, creates a different. And interestingly, again, in these arguments, these anthropologists actually say, in fact, there was a different story at stake. If the reproduction was that important, then women were actually, if you're going to take the instinct and biology actually seriously, then in fact, in the early stages, giving birth was more important. So men were actually more dispensable. That's why they were being sent to war and to hunting and so on. It wasn't just simply their physical difference. Again, these are theories. So if the theories are going, they're using these discourses to talk about how these stories actually have a life of their own that makes it difficult to break through. And again, for me, the most important part of these stories are how they live on and why they live on. And in that sense, they even argue that if men have more affairs because it's just the way their instincts is so and so forth. So the idea that they're using these evolutionary stories in denaturalize actually ends up in and of itself creating a different kind of stories that from a reproductive standpoint, again, if they are arguing for that, it becomes even a very strange situation where you see men becoming the ones who become the children take their last names from in many of the societies nowadays, or they become the ones for whom the legitimate heir becomes the son, and so on and so forth, and through the father. So these are very deeply embedded, as again anthropologists have discussed, cultural origin stories that become extremely powerful, become difficult to unravel, and they can persist despite contradictory evidences. So what is in the way we are dealing with these stories is to actually unpack both what is in the language and what is that we have come to consider as part of the culture, that we have cultured this way. And in that sense, if it's cultured, then we have to think about shifting cultures and constantly changing those instead of allowing for legitimizing ideologies, because this is not simply culture. This is the status quo that there are ways that people actually want to hold on to. Some people who have power want to hold on to, and that is something that we constantly have to really look to dismantle, to unsettle, and so on and so forth. The other side of the story, as I said, is this question of equality that does not actually create an equal gender relation based on equality, but to add women to basically to the consuming population. So for instance, one of these researchers shows that in 1968, a cigarette company in the United States decides to target women to bring them to consume tobacco. And what do they say? The ad says, "You've come a long way, baby." Women, according to the carefully constructed rhetoric, in this sense, have moved away from their historic oppressed status, and now they can enjoy the full complement of 20th century consumer pleasure. So in this sense, as many of us have heard again and again, equality becomes to do everything else that men do, regardless of what they do and what they do. So rather than thinking the potentials, the particularities of everything that women can and have contributed throughout history, they consider these consuming kind of ways in which women can now feel liberated. So a different notion of liberating becomes actually the issue. So this is not, of course, something that we cannot see why it had happened, even within the feminists. There was, in the society where women were denied social and religious, and in many other economic and political, and we saw in our election, we're seeing what's happening. We see the role of women. We see how, interestingly, even women themselves say, women cannot become a president. The US is not ready for it yet. I mean, we actually make claims ourselves, perpetuating the same story, making women to sit in the background because we think women are not ready. We are half of the population, and we're not coming out to say, at least we as women should not make those claims. But we ourselves also even go that far to say that. So interestingly, to go to this thing, Andrea Dossett, for instance, is a Canadian anthropologist who worked actually on the question of parenting. She takes from Sarah Roddick, who was trying to say that instead of using the word mother as a noun, we should use the word mothering as an act, as a verb. And in that sense, say mothering is a particular kind of act that men can also take and do. Andrea Dossett comes and takes this and celebrates it, but then shows that even in Canada, it was very interesting. When men were sitting home and when men taking care of their children, they said they were feeling guilty because they were not providing for the family. Women, on the other hand, when they were going to work, they were saying they felt guilty because they were not being the real mother. So she's talking about how these cultural ways of, again, thinking who should be the mother, who should actually take care of. If a father does something, take care of the children, it becomes hero for us. Is a mother, God forbid, takes 1 second of her work and not take care of the children, becomes not a good mother. So those are the things that I think are important to take. If a scholarship can teach us anything, is exactly these situations, to see in what sense we can actually really think about breaking apart these stories that we constantly tell ourselves. Even those of us who consider ourselves feminists, who completely believe in equality and so on and so forth, get to this point of almost thinking about these issues. And so in that sense, one of the things that is significant, I think, is to think about constant call for interplay between gender equality and gender differences, and focus on how context, space, time, and even embodying a particular form of being in the world matters in how equality and difference can interact. So instead of letting go of differences, how we can actually appreciate and actually embrace those differences and make those differences become the condition of making the world a better world. So I think one of the things that it's very important for me to constantly remind myself that actually in many ways I don't want to become the way men historically have functioned. I want to see what is, as Vina does again, talks about, is that when violence erupts, we constantly talk about who goes to war, who gets killed, how then the buildings are erected, and so on and so forth. And we rarely remember how the ordinary life gets sustained. Who actually sustains the ordinary life? And again, this is essentializing the role of women, which has to be taken apart, but is the same significant that those hunter-gatherer stories have been told. The role of women who are in many ways the very basic, the essence of sustaining individuals, children, communities, their men, and so on and so forth, gets reduced to this idea. So I think two issues, if I want to stop, and I don't have time to continue, if I want to stop here, is to say two things. Equality in many situations is very important, including, for instance, Iran, where people are still fighting over equal rights of many, many things. So it's very important. But when it comes particularly to the different conditions we are living with, we have to see how war, immigration, violence, domestic violence, and all these different forces are actually creating conditions where, in fact, equality in the law does not suffice. So we have to really think about two things: disrupting what is in the language that reinforces gender inequality. What is in the culture and the stories we tell as scholars. We tell stories that are very dangerous in many ways, in many situations. So how we become actually very much aware of those stories and catch ourselves when we perpetuate them in our everyday life. And so for that reason, I want to really, again, celebrate the life of those women who actually, in the everyday practices, in the midst of all those situations where life becomes impossible, render the sustaining of life possible for themselves and for others. And for that, happy Women's Day.